Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the YouTube channel of All Saints with Holy Trinity. It's great to welcome you back here for this little lunchtime pause to look at the scripture readings that are coming up on Sunday. I pause here each Tuesday and I'm joined by three guests, different ministers, all ministering, preaching in different contexts. And we take a look at the Bible readings that are set for the upcoming Sunday service. Some of us are preparing sermons on these texts. For others of us, it's more of a thought exercise. But we have a look and we try and listen to God through listening to one another and see what these ancient texts have to say to us today. What is the Spirit nudging us on? What is drawing our eye? What is challenging? What is bringing comfort? So if you're watching live, we'd love to know that you're with us. That helps us feel like we're not alone, which is really nice. So do check in and use the comments and say hi. But also, please do join the conversation. Get your Bible out, open up your app, whatever it is you look at the scriptures on, and share with us what verses really, get you between the eyes, what gets under your skin, and what questions does it raise, and how does this land in your life, in whatever it is you're doing. So I can see that Rachel's here. Great, thank you, Rachel. Rachel's a real faithful viewer of this. Look forward to your comments today, Rachel, on these texts. But while I type up into the comments the readings that we're looking at today, I'm going to let my guests introduce themselves to you. They've all been on the Muse with me before, so they're familiar faces to those of you who've been here a while. But I'm going to ask them to say a little bit about who they are. And also today, as we were gathering, we were talking, folks, weren't we, just about how actually it feels a bit miserable ministering at the minute. Life is not how we would want it to be. We're not able to plan some of the big events we would normally do. So rather than sharing with you what's making us miserable about ministering through a pandemic, I'm going to ask all my guests to introduce themselves and just to share with you something that's bringing them joy at the minute. So thank you. I'm going to hand over. I think Stuart's going to kick off while I type up the readings.
Okay, afternoon. My name's Stuart. I work in the Mission and Ministry Department of Leicester Diocese, and it's my second Minister's Muse that I've been involved in. The first all-male panel, which we have taken the mick out of Wendy for already, just to make her feel bad, because that always helps. But it's good to be with you again. What brings me joy? I'm banging on about stories at the moment and gathering stories. That's part of what I'm doing in the diocese and that role. And just some of the stories that I'm getting to read and to hear really bring me joy. The one that really just brought me joy and made me smile so much was a guy who, Jeffrey Walker, who wrote into to the bishop after having heard about the fact that we want some stories, just telling us about how he relates to so many people on Instagram, about little stories of who he is, about how much he really loves his wife, and how they live together in serving God. He's 90. He was 90 yesterday, and he has something like 360,000 followers on Instagram. And it just brought me huge joy, and I've really enjoyed following him.
Is that you done, Stuart?
That's me done, Chris. Sorry.
My name's Chris Taylor. I'm the Anglican chaplain at Loughborough University. We are welcoming our students back as we speak, certainly the freshers anyway, and others coming back into the town as well. What's giving me joy at the moment is that I'm involved in helping to reopen one of our local churches that hasn't opened for a while. I'm having a lot of fun with that and dealing with all sorts of bits and pieces that crop up. But more importantly, it's the fact that another church is going to be open for worship in our general locality. So I'm really enjoying that. And of course, on this not quite all-male panel, because we have got Wendy here, I'm enjoying this Minister's Muse, and I enjoy it as a participant on the chat and as a participant on the panel. I find the whole thing really great and I love it.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, my name is Andrew Race. I am an Anglican priest up in the northwest of the diocese in a place called Castle Donington and Lockington, and we're right up by East Midlands Airport and the new East Midlands Gateway, and we are having warehouses built all around us as we speak. But the villages have retained their identity and are fighting to stay relevant and noticed. But that's us up in the northwest of the diocese. What brings me joy? Well, in our household, we've just taken delivery 2 weeks ago of a puppy, and she is a delight, a little miniature Dachshund called Peggy, and we're absolutely loving having her about, although she does need to learn a few things in life. Wendy, over to you.
Well, don't we all, Andrew? Yes, we all need puppy training, I suppose, one way or another. Well, thank you, everyone. And my name's Wendy. I'm the rector of All Saints in Loughborough. And what's bringing me joy at the minute is watching Ghosts. Oh, well, no, actually, it's all winter telly. So Ghosts is back on, brilliant comedy. Bake Off, which I never really got into once it moved to Channel 4, but I just need some comfort telly at the minute. And Strictly's coming back. So moving forward to the rest of the autumn, all of my sermon illustrations probably relate either to dancing in a sequin boob tube or to you know, the rise or not of your loaf. So there you go. While we've been saying hello, Helen has also joined us, and so has Sue. Welcome back, Helen and Sue. And Rachel says, Stuart, she thinks that's the same couple on Instagram that she follows, and she thinks they make her so happy too. Yeah. So thank you for that. Well, introductions out the way, let's come to the scripture that is set for this Sunday. We're going to start with the gospel. We're going to come back to Jesus, and our reading is Matthew chapter 21, beginning at verse 33 to the end of the chapter. And it's another one of these parables. It follows straight on from the passage last week, where Jesus, the setting of this, for those who use the language of the liturgical year, is Holy Week. Jesus has been causing a bit of an uproar in the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, sort of the leaders, religious leaders have come to him and said, you know, what are you playing at? Whose authority is this under? And we had the parable last week about people in the vineyard. And then he carries on with another hard-hitting parable that basically tells them that, yeah, they're on the wrong path, that they're not listening, and woe is them. Stuart, you were going to kick us off on this reading.
I was just briefly, and just kind of coming back from your TV listings of your watch habits. Sometimes, you know, you start preparing a sermon, you find your way in, and your starting sentence, and mine would have been location, which works for kind of 2 out of 3 of the readings, and then falls down a little bit on the Philippians. But hey, never let a good sermon introduction and illustration get in the way of the truth that you've called to preach. So rather than spending 2 days trying to force my sermon into the sermon illustration, but location, I think, is really important in this gospel reading, and also in the Exodus narrative as well, in terms of the Mount Sinai. So yeah, as you were saying, Wendy, Jesus speaking and preaching in the temple and giving hard lessons to core religious leadership. It's a really kind of shocking parable in that sense. There's a landowner. He has a vineyard, a fence, a wine press, a watchtower. What else could you possibly need within the vineyard? You have everything there that you need. You have servants or tenants to read it and to lead and to serve the land, and then the landowner goes away, leaving everything that they could possibly want. And it ends with rejection, and it ends with failure, and it ends with failure of the landowners, the tenants, and a real challenge to them, to the way that they have behaved. So that kind of targeting religious leadership, and Jesus pointing and picking away at the way that the religious leaders were acting is really a hard thing to hear, I think, particularly for anybody who's involved in religious leadership, because it makes you feel really, really bad. I think there's a subtle shift in the parable, which helps us see how religious leaders can move from being the guardian of a tradition to being the owner of it. And they were kind of left in guardianship. They were left as tenants, but they became owners. They reinforced the boundaries so much that they wouldn't let anybody else in. And that, I think, is the kind of core shocking piece of the parable, because all parables are shocking in one way or another. And it sums up in verse 43 for me, which says, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produce the fruits of the kingdom. Yeah. And you have to read that parable in the light of verse 43, because it just unpacks everything. And so actually, you are so out of where you should be. You have moved from being a guardian. You have become an owner, and you are looking to exclude rather than produce fruits.
Yeah.
That's where I start with this one.
I'm really interested in that, Stuart, because I struggle often when I'm reading the Gospels when Jesus's harshest condemnation is for religious leaders. And you can't read that and have one of these around your neck, either physically or metaphorically, and not just be a little bit like, yeah, okay. I know, and there's a context. I suppose there's a danger of, transferring it. He's not talking to us directly in that sense, but actually we need to hear that same warning, don't we? And I like that idea that you're drawing out of when in leadership do we become, gatekeepers who keep people out rather than being ones who bring a gift, I guess, and invite people in. Chris, you're looking really deep.
Oh, well, I listen to parables like this, and I always sort of rationalize them by saying, well, it's to the Pharisees, isn't it? And then people like you come along and go, well, actually, possibly about people like us. And then I look round at the church that we serve and what that church is doing or not doing. I look at who it includes, how it includes the people it includes. Who it excludes, who it says it doesn't exclude but ends up excluding. And actually, then I become part of the ownership that Stuart was talking about. I loved it because I misheard that first. I heard odor. And actually there is a big, bad smell in parts of our church, in the way that we don't welcome and in the way that we do exclude and in the way that our leadership pays lip service to welcome and inclusion and actually kicks it off to the side most of the time and doesn't address that. So that's where I went in the context of what Stuart and you were saying. But then I also thought to myself, who does Jesus spend most of his time with in the Gospels? Who does he talk to most of the time? Who is he most trying to influence? And it is the leadership of the temple. It's the scribes, it's the Pharisees, it's the Sadducees. If you go through all the Gospels, you'll find that they are the people, apart from God, where Jesus disappears off of a mountain to pray, they're the people that Jesus spends all his time with. Now, he's doing that for a reason. He's doing that because he wants to see change. He wants to see that leadership work out for itself that the whole story of the ownership of the vineyard that they've constructed is constructed on false premises around control and domination and not about love and inclusion. I mean, obviously, it's all about killing the prophets and stoning the this and doing the that. But actually, it's Jesus wanting them to change their minds. And then you look at this, he will put those wretches to a miserable death. That in itself, when you think who's speaking those lines, those verses, that in itself is shocking. Yeah. Because Jesus isn't about miserable deaths and casting into outer darkness, not as we understand Jesus anyway. So again, that parable shocks. It shocks the Pharisees because it challenges them. And it shocks us now today because we hear Jesus talking about, and is that what he means? Is that what he means? Is he going to, cast everybody out into darkness who's ever sort of lifted a thought against or decided that they want to own a brick of their church or whatever it is? Is that the fate that awaits us, or is there a fate of grace and love and understanding of the human condition that follows Jesus's resurrection and ascension? Amen.
Amen, Chris. I'm feeling convicted. I'm hoping there's grace for religious leaders. I'm really, I'm banking my salvation on that. But it is a hard parable, and again, if you hold leadership, yeah, so I don't know whether I'd preach it out that way, but I'd certainly in my own personal life, I'm kind of hearing that. I know Sue has said, well, Helen said she loves that picture of guardian versus owner that Stuart kicked us off with. And Sue says, we definitely do need to hear that warning. And I am challenged by how often history repeats itself. People remove the oppressors and they in turn do the oppressing, which again is something that we become aware of, don't we? And Rachel says, I just love the idea that it's the rejected stone that is seen as least use, which is the most prized. Andrew, where would you go with this gospel reading? What's getting at you today?
I would choose a different reading. No, not at all. I mean, yes. I mean, I don't wish to repeat anything that's been said, but perhaps just to bring us back to that place of hope that I'd want to draw out, having looked at the hard stuff. And I suppose what struck me was just the abundance of the land over. Stuart began, I think, didn't he, Stuart? No, he provided everything that he could. It was the best vineyard that there was. We can read it, and and he kept sending people. In the end, he sent his own son. Oh, it's all right. I've given them everything else. Why not? And in a sense, that just reminds us how God approaches us. He comes to us again and again and again with an abundance of generosity. And he kind of knows what the end of the story is going to be. And one of your people have commented on it already about the stone that the builders rejected. And if we were hearing this parable as one of the little people, so to speak, the ones who didn't have the power, and we're thinking, well, what is our place in all of this? This crappy life that we find ourselves in, where I've lost my job, or I've never really got the qualifications I wanted, or my mum died last week. Life's just a bum right now. Pardon my French. Where is the hope in this? And of course, the hope is that actually God works through our brokenness, which of course is the other challenge to those of us who are leaders. It's not just to heed the warning, but to enter into that place of brokenness through which God does what only God can do.
Yeah. Because
that's the fascinating piece that is we haven't got to Philippians, but Paul is writing from a place of brokenness, and the lectionary sometimes joins all those things up together, where absolutely he's writing from I gave as much as I could, and that was sufficient.
And so each and every one of us, the one that is broken, God has a place for all of us. Chris's point.
I think I'm with you there. And one other thing is I've just written down unpromising restarts. So it's a stone that's been rejected. I mean, you think of St. Peter, who is not necessarily the brightest button in the box. And you look at Jesus building the church on Peter, unpromising stone, and then the church being founded on Jesus, who in this context appears to be an unpromising stone as far as the church leadership is concerned, or the temple leadership is concerned. So there's comfort in that, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew.
I think the other thing that I'm really struck by in this one and in last week is the role of the crowds, because everyone is playing to the crowd or is concerned about the crowds. And when you, Chris, was saying, Jesus spends a lot of time with the religious leaders, I thought, that's interesting, because I would have said, if you'd asked me that, like a Sunday school question, no, Jesus spends more time with the outcast. But I think you've got a good point, and he does, doesn't he? But he often, when he's saying something, it's like he's saying it to the important person, but he's saying it in earshot of the unimportant. And I think there's sometimes like a double communication that's going on. So again, which I think is almost what you were touching on a bit, Andrew. It's like, so this parable directed at those who have authority, but actually there's comfort for those who are listening to that going, oh, hold on a minute, because actually, it kind of like it communicates across both ways. And I think there's something as well about, the scribes, the chief priests, they were more concerned about their own status and their own power, about what might happen with the crowd maybe, than actually listening to Jesus, and how often we do that. And maybe that's not just a leadership thing, but in our Christian lives, playing to the crowd isn't always the right way to go.
And of course, it's one of three parables, isn't it? That Jesus speaking to us to kind of gets us to think about our values, because our values then go on to influence our attitudes, and of course our attitudes then determine our actions. And each of those three parables that this one is a part of, it speaks to values, attitudes, actions.
That sounds like a very good sermon. Values, attitudes, actions. Stuart, you were just saying something. Do you want to
No,
comment?
I just think that was really fascinating about the crowds listening to Jesus speaking to the crowds, but speaking to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees realizing he was speaking to them. The crowd realizing, probably before the Pharisees, that he was speaking to the Pharisees. Yeah. And go, oh, and then actually it's placed within the Gospel of Matthew, and where Matthew is placing that story in the overall passage of where the gospel is going, and Jesus's journey, who it speaks to then, and how it speaks. So many different levels of the way Scripture speaks and communicates. But I like that the crowds listening in.
Well, it's an interesting thought for our time of the way we're preaching right now, because when we're preaching, often, like I know from our church, we're doing a service in the building, we're live streaming, and I have an eye to or an ear to who is listening to these words, because it's those who are intentionally there in the building, or maybe they've been dragged by a relative or something. That does happen. But also maybe someone will see this online, and how it's another, you're sort of where you're communicating it across a range of things. I think there's a bit of a reflection there on how to preach in this current time, but we will move on and we'll stay with the Scripture. I must just say that Rachel says that because next week Rachel is actually preaching at All Saints. Rachel is exploring her vocation to ordained ministry, so she's going to preach, and she says next week, because it is a set of parables, this, so she's got a really challenging one next week. Next week is the casting into the outer darkness week, and she says she's working on it. So anyway, I hope you'll be tuned in next week, Rachel, as well. Shall we Andrew, you very bravely said, when I said, how would you deal with this passage? You said you would pick another one. And you were really drawn to the Exodus passage, which the lectionary basically sort of picks out all these verses. It's basically the 10 Commandments. It's basically Exodus chapter 20, but for brevity, you sort of, it leaves out some of the juicier bits. But it is the 10 Commandments. Now, years ago, I mean, and I know I'm not going to work out who's the oldest of all, but even predating my oldest guest, it used to be the thing, didn't it, that, the 10 Commandments were recited in church. And I know my previous parish had the 10 Commandments up on boards in the chancel end, I don't know if anyone's still got that in their church, anyone here who's watching. But the 10 Commandments, Andrew, what grabbed you about them today?
Well, it wasn't the 10 Commandments per se, actually. I suppose what grabbed me was that they were given to us and spoken by God. And it reminded me, I suppose, of the overarching story of God that's taking place, that this reading kind of fits within, if you wish. And don't forget, at this point, the people have been slaves in Egypt. They've been rescued by God, and they've been taken to this place of freedom across the sea, and it is hell. They don't like it. And funny enough, it's the crowds this time who are complaining like heck. What have you brought us to? What we had before was far better. Thank you. And so I think we just need to remember, really, that God then speaks into their situation, having rescued them. And of course, our story of life and faith is with a God who rescues, not just to take us from something, but to take us to something. And the 10 Commandments are, if you wish, one of the routes that God uses to take us to something else, something better. I mentioned at the beginning that that one of the things that brings us joy is our new puppy. And we're discovering, perhaps the hard way, that if this puppy is given free range, it's actually not very good for it, and it's not very good for us. It creates havoc. It needs some boundaries. It needs a safe space in which to learn about what life is all about. And in a sense, the 10 Commandments are God's way of saying to the people, look, I brought you to freedom. I am God. That's how the passage begins, doesn't it? I am the Lord your God. And these commandments will help you live your life in your new freedom in a way that is of me. And they begin, they're the foundational, some of the foundational, going back to that word value, there's some of the foundational values of who we are before God. One of the commentaries I was reading suggested this is a pivot point. God, having rescued us now, is taking us from that place of rescue into relationship, into covenantal relationship. And I would need to explore a little bit more about what that meant in relation to the Ten Commandments. I'm very drawn to what Richard Rohr says on this kind of thing, that the commandments provide us with a clear structure, a container in which to learn about who we are and who God is, in which we put down our roots, but from which we sprout and bear fruit, to go back to that gospel reading and ties in with the Philippians reading. It's a very rich material. I think we can talk to the cows come home about whether God was on a mountain or how Moses heard God speak, whether the Ten Commandments are the only ones. Of course, they weren't. They were the beginning of them all. But it's at the point in their journey with God that God speaks to the people and gives them some boundaries, if you wish. It gives them a context within which to understand themselves and his purposes for them. Yeah,
I really like that, the rescue to relationship. The alliteration works for me as a former Methodist preacher with 3-point sermons. I like that. But also that linking back into the mention of the fruit in the gospel reading and the boundaries out of which we grow and bear fruit. Rachel was saying that for her, the 10 Commandments were transformed when she looked at them on the GIF course, Journey in Faith, which is something that the Diocese of Leicester runs. And she talks about when they're broken down into love of God and love of neighbour. And Sue says, Andrew, thanks for the reference to freedom. In that context, I wonder if these boundaries are the ones which can help them be truly free. This is particularly obvious for the Sabbath, the free to rest stuff. We've lost Chris. I don't think it was a theological or ecclesiological falling out. I suspect something's happened at his end with his internet. But Stuart, the Ten Commandments passage in Exodus.
Yeah, I think building on what you're saying, Andrew, it's the principles for living in relationship with Yahweh are what's there, isn't it? It's we reduce them to tablets and to things on a board at the back of a church, or in the minister's study before you go out to the vestry, before you go out to preach. All those horrible things.
At the church I was in on Sunday, St Nicholas Lockington, there's a massive tympanum right above the altar, and it's the coat of arms for Queen Anne. And just in case this dominant image kind of gets us kind of focused on the wrong thing, either side of this massive tympanum are the 10 Commandments and the Our Father, just in case we got our focus wrong.
Just to put you in your place before you go out and do anything vaguely faithful.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. So, but relationship changes it, doesn't it? It takes it out of a list of commandments that are to be absolutely obeyed, and puts it in a relational piece, which is what's happening in Exodus. Is God, Yahweh, is forming relationship with Israel, and that's that revelational piece of these are the attitudes that you should have to be able to spend time as a in covenant relationship with Yahweh. So it's their gift. They're not Ofsted.
Ofsted not a gift to an education.
Could possibly discuss. They're not something we have them as something that we people even remember them today and judge themselves against it. I can't come to church because, well, I've just looked down and it says you shall not murder, but that's a bad example. I can't come to church because I have borne false witness, or and people will throw them back and say I can't do that because I'm not anywhere near living the standard that these commandments require of me. And yet, if you see them as relational boundaries or barriers, then boundaries that allow you to be within relationship because of them, then it becomes something more, not softer, but more accessible and less exclusive. It comes back to the who's good enough to follow the commandments. Everybody fails every one of those, and really, you get down to verse 17. You shall not covet, and that kind of. If you've got that far down being fine, you suddenly hit you shall not covet. It's like, okay, that's everyone. That's the final piece. Nobody.
We all need boundaries. I mean, take any football team, you know, the rules of the game, aren't there, is what we say. And whilst we have to play within the lines of the field and aim the ball for the net or whatever it is, at the end of the day, we still have to work as a team. And that team only works not because of the rules, but because of the relationships within that team. And the same is true with us and God and each other. And dare I say it, you know, it makes reference there to the Sabbath. I was just so struck how that applies to our relationship with creation as well. And if there's one thing that lockdown in these times has drawn all of our attention to, is to reprioritize creation. And that Sabbath that was almost imposed upon us is a reminder of a deep biblical value to keep the Lord's day holy.
Yeah, and I have to say, Andrew, that's where I'm drawn, because we're marking Harvest Festival, which we're also going to keep as Creation Sunday at our church on Sunday. And I was going to do away with the lectionary readings and get something harvesty, and I thought, actually, no, these are the texts to stay with particularly, and it's the Exodus text that really draws me, because again, this word about relational. And the commandments are all about our relationships with God and with one another, and therefore with creation as well. In fact, Helen's put in the comments here, she says, I love the way the commandments essentially seek to restore that covenant relationship we have with both God and one another. This is how to do being human in the world, and that interconnectedness. But it strikes me, it's interesting, we take it for granted, don't we, but that they had to have a commandment about Sabbath. So on one level, like I'm a mother of teenagers, and there's a certain 16-year-old not very far from me at the minute who's not doing lots of face-to-face lessons because college is not like that at the minute, and isn't really dressed yet today and probably won't be, and that kind of, like, I don't know, that line of least resistance. I kind of think, well, maybe
I've only got my shirt on.
I don't need to know. I don't. Thank you, Andrew. What an image! What an image! I don't know. It's weird to me to think so. Yeah, so lots of us, will be lazy if we get the choice. So Sabbath actually must be about more than just stopping doing things, mustn't it? It's got to be deeper than that. And I'm not sure it's just entirely individual, is it? So, and in fact, the verses are there. It's about, it's also about, don't let your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, or your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns do any work. So it's not just an individual, it's not me time, which I think is different. Sabbath has also got to be about restoration and relationship.
Which is the one thing that Jesus kept tripping up with the Pharisees on again and again, was this relationship with the Sabbath that had become this legalistic thing, that bound their relationship with God. It prevented, the Sabbath is there for a reason.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a phrase which is escaping me at the moment about who the Sabbath is for, rather than the other way around. It'll trip off your tongue, Stuart, I'm sure.
No, that idea of rest as doing nothing is really quite fierce, isn't it? You find it all over the place. I'm going to rest. I'm going to stop. I'm going to rest. But there's something about Sabbath rest which is doing stuff which re-energizes you and which takes you to a different place, as much as not doing things. So it's allowing space for relationships, it's allowing space for others, and rest and renewal, not just stopping. I think sometimes when we stop, you think, I need to be doing something else. I've got too much guilt to stop. But active rest in that sense of Sabbath.
Which speaks really interestingly, doesn't it, into what our eyes are being open to, perhaps, in terms of culture at the moment, and particularly our economic culture, which places value on and worth on productivity and constantly doing, so that when we do rest, we're led to believe automatically that therefore we're doing nothing, and if I rest, therefore I'm not worth anything. And we've got something deeply prophetic to speak into here, don't we? That is rooted deeply in Sabbath. And one of the ways perhaps the church can seek to help redeem our economic culture and the madness that life is at the moment is to draw us back to these fundamental principles of taking time, resting. That resting isn't doing nothing. It is deeply relational. It gives us that opportunity to breathe, to recalibrate.
I like John Swinton's work on time and Sabbath rest, and he does take he comes from writing from a practical theologian basis, but also a nursing background. I think in his background, if I can remember the name of the book, I'll get it. It's orange in the cover,
Really
and I can kind of reach around it, find it in a minute. But he talks particularly about how time has been taken over by productivity construct, and actually it's not what we produce, it's who we are. And he particularly writes really well and very thoughtfully about dementia and mental health and well-being within the whole area of what time is and productivity is, which affects then who we are and how we take Sabbath. Really important.
And of course, there isn't anything wrong with productivity in itself. It's the extreme that we've driven it to, which goes hand in hand with this kind of, this extraction. You've got to draw as much as you can from every ounce of possibility, don't you? And
so there's something in these commandments. There's the valuing of human life, which is precious. We want to preach that. I mean, Rachel raises a challenging point for all of us, which I think, and we do get a lot with the Old Testament texts such as this. She says she finds it really hard when she's reading these texts and the dehumanization of slaves as objects. So the slaves are on a par with the animals and so on. And of course, we also have it with women. I do always like to point out in some ways that in actual fact, the 10 Commandments are clearly just for you boys, because you're not allowed to covet your neighbour's wife, who's also obviously an object in all of this. And how we kind of deal with that. And so Rachel says, it's hard because the way it's written, it's from the mouth of God. So how we bring some context to that, because it's now sort of 10 to 1. I'm not sure we can kind of answer it deeply, but I wonder, Stuart, do you just want to reflect briefly how do you help people hear these texts in a life-giving way, without kind of absorbing that kind of ownership language? In 60 seconds.
In 60 seconds.
Yeah.
While Stuart thinks, can I offer something?
Yeah, please do, Andrew. Yeah, should come to you.
I think very much we have to speak to context. So we have to help our readers and our hearers understand the context of the time, and that even though God was speaking into the context of the time, doesn't mean to say that that's the lasting word of Scripture on the matter. And then the other thing I think is, as one of us said at the beginning, it might have been you, Chris, or maybe it was you, Wendy, I can't remember. We read these scriptures through the lenses of the gospel, through Jesus Christ. And even though God at the time was seeking to redeem Israel, to rescue them, actually there's a redemption necessary all the way through. Patriarchy needs to be redeemed. End of.
Excellent. Andrew, you can come on again. It absolutely does. It absolutely does. Chris, you took a little bit of a Sabbath rest.
My interweb completely collapsed on me.
Don't worry, well, you've come at just the right time. Well,
before loudly with my microphone off, just in case I reconnected by accident.
Before you've come in at just the right time. We haven't yet got to Philippians, and you were going to lead on that for us. So let's just have a little look at this. We're continuing in this letter. We are chapter 3, verse 4b to 14. And here's Paul again talking from this place of brokenness, but saying that actually it's all about, which, if in doubt, is usually the answer to most questions. Chris, what are you grabbed with this passage?
The thing that really grabbed me actually was the final verse. I press on towards the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God. Now, lots of people read this and think that he's striving towards death and heaven. He isn't. Or if you read it on this translation, he's striving to fulfill his call. I think it's great that Rachel is tuned in, for instance, today, because I know that she's striving to achieve her call. So this passage from Philippians may well speak to her. I think that's the absolute keystone of this passage. Yeah, we all know I like Philippians. I don't know anyone who doesn't. It's just a really lovely paean of praise to a group of a small church that Paul set up that is doing pretty well. And he's saying you're doing pretty well. It's all about watch out. And this is just rejoice. This is another one of those rejoice, I say, rejoices. You're saved by Jesus. Keep it up, guys. Whatever gains I have as a Pharisee, as a member of the temple, I count as loss. There is a bit in here that I find faintly frightening and worrying, which is that whatever I've had. So Paul, I don't think Paul wasn't married, didn't have children. And his gains are his churches. His children are the churches that he's established, that he is deeply attached to. He doesn't count them as rubbish. So I think we have to be really careful when we read Paul, when we start to go, well, my call takes me out of all this and I become this incredible sort of celibate person. And I treat everything around me as rubbish apart from my call from God to be whatever I'm called by God to be. We can't actually dismiss everything else as rubbish. And I take issue with the wonderful writer of the letter here, because I disagree. I don't think anything that God has made is rubbish. It may not be as important as the call, but if you treat the wider view of Paul as the father of these churches and the nurturer of these fledgling churches, then they're really, really important to him. They're not rubbish at all. So he doesn't actually fulfill his words here. What he's saying, I think, is that all that stuff I had as a member of the circumcision, once again, guys, we've all got the circumcision going on here. It's all jolly exciting and painful. Anyway, yeah, I count all that stuff that went before Jesus as rubbish, before God put this call on my heart. That was rubbish. Everything since, this is really important. This is part of the striving to fulfill that call. And I want, if I'm St. Paul, I want you guys to be striving to fulfill that call as well. Maybe, you know, with the single-minded dedication, with all that stuff, and an awareness that the people around you are saved by grace and loved by God always, which I think sometimes Paul forgets in his letter writing, but he always comes back to it. The heart of Paul's epistles, all of them. And I don't think I've not seen the writing on this yet, but I see Paul's epistles as speaking to grace and love at all times and dealing with little problems that need ironing out, rather than speaking to us, the wider population, about those little problems and telling us that they're relevant to us. He's speaking into a specific context, the overarching context, as it is in the whole of the Bible that we study and love, is God's love and forgiveness and inclusion. And that's what it's all about. And I think Paul can be read in that way too, and should be. Amen.
2 sermons off you today. And you weren't here for half of it. You've excelled yourself, Chris. You've excelled yourself. Andrew, what about you in this Philippians text?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Paul is speaking to, that is a big thing where I might take a little bit of issue with Chris, is that he's speaking to our paradigms of thinking. That's big stuff, you know. We all inherit these paradigms of thinking, whether it's our church traditions or our ecclesiologies or our theologies or just our worldview. And he's saying these paradigms of thinking aren't the be all and end all. And of course, one of those was this whole issue to do with circumcision. That was part of, and was one of the key indicators way back in the day of Abraham as being one of the people of God. This signified the covenantal relationship. And so I think one of the links in our 3 readings in terms of, you know, rescue to relationship, I know, Chris, you missed out on that part of the discussion a bit, is is this move to relationship. So with Abraham, the covenant was about circumcision. With Moses and the people in the wilderness, it was about the 10 Commandments. With us, it's Jesus. And whilst the rules of the game, if you wish, aren't unimportant, the focus has got to be Jesus and Jesus' work of grace in and through us. That word about rubbish, I didn't take to mean irrelevant. I took to read as about what we give priority to, but I recognize that might be me wanting to make sense of the scriptures. Paul could have meant rubbish entirely.
I mean, he says that everything he's had, he says he has suffered the loss of all things and counts them as rubbish.
Counts them as rubbish, I know, absolutely.
The loss of everything.
Yeah, because for him, Jesus is so important.
Yeah, as opposed to, I mean, I find myself in absolute agreement, but I don't get the taking issue, because what I said was all the stuff that went before the call was rubbish.
Yeah.
And I think that actually holds true. Paul doesn't regard himself as a Pharisee. He doesn't regard himself as a stand-up temple member. He regards himself as an ambassador for Jesus Christ. And that's what he's called to be. Yeah. So everything else is rubbish, but everything following the call isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I find myself in agreement with you, Andrew.
I'm hearing you. Yeah. Thank you. No, I think we are in agreement.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how much we strive on these things, it comes back to that message that Paul hammers home again and again. It doesn't matter how hard we try, and it's got nothing to do with us.
No, completely.
It comes back to that act of grace.
Yeah.
And
grace. And I am going to throw in the bit that I threw in before we started about the 10 Commandments, which were about relationship then. But actually, if we look and we read it through the lens of the gospel, Jesus has said, there is only one commandment, and that's love, even though he dressed it up as two. There's only one commandment, and that is love. And all the 10 Commandments speak about relationship and care and love. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as does the most difficult commandment, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And in that way,
which it turns out is more complex than to write it down. Yeah. Stuart, have you got any wisdom on the Philippians text?
I think just that heavenly call is not an individual thing. I know Paul is pressing on towards a heavenly call, but he's writing to a community. And I think we sometimes individualize Paul. And he's saying this is about us. So, I press on towards the goal of the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. Let those of us then that follow on from that. And I think he's about, he's writing to a church. He's not writing to an individual. And he's not bigging himself up, but there's something about the us of following that heavenly call, which is to be in relationship with Christ, to be in relationship with God through Christ. And we hold fast to what we have attained. It's not we nail it to ourselves sometimes, but we can't do that without others. And that takes me back to Exodus, and to the giving of the 10 Commandments was done in the presence of the people who were at the foot of the mountain, who weren't allowed to go onto the mountain, but who still saw the thundering and the lightning and the voices and all the things that Moses saw, but couldn't get there. And then we have the cornerstone that was rejected, that allows that place to be, and we can come in Philippians, as Paul says, and we can press on towards the goal of our heavenly call.
There's something in there about resilience and perseverance in the face of hardship as well, isn't there? Yeah. That Paul's speaking to, and clearly Moses would have been speaking. I mean, they were 3 months in, weren't they, to their journey? Gosh, they had another 39 years, and
Yeah, I was just going to suggest maybe that is the paradigm for preaching this Sunday. I don't want another 39 years of a pandemic.
Push.
Chris is desperate to come back in. Chris, go on.
Up to verse 16. Only let us hold fast to what we've attained. I do think that again, there is this being of one mind. If we're going to go into the verses that weren't in there, it's an abiding call from Paul. And I think actually it holds exactly with what Stuart was saying. Be of one mind. It isn't just me about me. It's me to us and about us, says St. Paul. We need to be of one mind. Yeah, and we need to be consistent and persistent. Consistent and persistent. That's my sermon title for Philippians.
Wow, we've got consistent and persistent. What we have something about rules to relationship.
Location.
Oh, location. We're coming to the end of our time. We've run over. I'm going to have to start starting the Muse earlier. Even without you, Chris, we managed to still run over. I'm just going to let these last few comments come from folks who've been with us. Sue says, it would be interesting to explore what society would now list instead of Paul's list. You know, what is it you leave behind? A certain weight, qualifications, school, hairstyle, clothing brand. Interesting one, Sue. And Helen says the key question for me in this is, how do we enter into resurrection life? How do we filter whatever our circumstances are through that value, be it possessions, relationships, goals, suffering? And Rachel says, yeah, Helen, I think that is a key theme across these readings, isn't it? Here's the law. What happens if you only focus on the law? It's more than just the law. They're doing well in the comment section.
Yeah, better
We've run over, but I would love to ask my guests. I'm going to ask Chris and then Stuart, because me and Andrew are actually preaching, although Andrew with different texts. But Chris, if you were preaching on Sunday, what do you feel? What's a sermon for this season and this Sunday out of these passages?
Well, for me, it would be, again, the inclusion. I'm sorry, it would be. I'd be looking at the church. I'd be asking the questions. I'd be saying, how are we living out this gospel of love as a church? And then I'd also ask, as a corollary of that, how are we living out this gospel of love during the pandemic, and how is it possible for us to do that? And I might throw in a couple of ideas of how it might be possible. But yeah, that'd be where
Thank you. So a sermon of questions.
Yep.
Stuart, where would you go with these?
I think I'd start with coveting my neighbour's ox.
Not ass. Or you just avoid that.
Just because I think it's relationship and how to live as community. That feeds into the Philippians. How do you do that? So that kind of catch-all commandment at the end about coveting, everybody's in there. So what do you need to do to live well together? And then if you work back up the commandments, what do you need to do to live well with God? And that's where I would go.
Thank you. Andrew, you're preaching, but not with these texts on Sunday. But if these were your texts, what kind of sermon might be brewing for you?
Yeah, I think I might. I'm not sure actually. I think I might focus on the Exodus reading in terms of journey and hardship, rescue and relationship, and just a reminder of the need to listen to God. You know, God speaks to us at different times in different ways. And, you know, our series we're going through now is, you know, how do we know that God has spoken? How do we know when God is speaking to us, and what stops us from hearing God speak? And so there are all sorts of little snippets in there that I might draw on to get us to think about how we prevent ourselves from hearing God.
Sounds good. And I am preaching, and interesting, Sue, you're also preaching this week, but on harvest, but you've gone for the harvest readings, and we've got Harvest Festival, but I'm going to stay with the lectionary. And I'm really drawn to the Exodus reading, and I want to try and explore this stuff about relationship, but that it's more than just our relationship with God, with neighbour, but also with the earth. So that whole Sabbath theme as well. But I think it lands back again with that gospel around the people that produce the fruits of the kingdom. And actually, you know, there are people in our society, in our world, who are living out the fruits of the kingdom in terms of climate justice, in terms of reconciliation. It's up to us to put down our barriers that we've got the answers, but to join in with what's going on. So I think that's the kind of sermon that's brewing. I think, although it's an all-age service with COVID secure masks and a load of hand sanitizer, so no idea how it's all going to go, but never mind. Thank you so much to my guests. We've run over again. I have to start starting this Muse earlier, but thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Chris. So sorry we lost you intermittently, and thank you to everyone who's joined in at home. And do join me next week as we continue our weekly little look at the scriptures.